The whole family was brutally murdered. The murderer tied all the members to the chairs and stuffed their mouths with meat. What was even more terrifying was that the meat was taken from the husband's body. Before he died, the murderer sprinkled salt and pepper on the husband to season it and then put it in the oven. 2 hours later, the husband's meat was grilled until it was golden brown on the outside and soft on the inside. It was so crispy that when cut, it looked like cold cuts. The internal organs of the husband were also made into side dishes and served on the table. All the family members at the dining table were forced to witness the brutal scene. When the family members died, their eyes were still wide open and their faces were filled with fear. But the husband was the most pitiful. He was left with only a headless body lying on the ground. After the police received a report about the massacre of this entire family, policewoman Lois immediately arrived at the scene. Lois had just entered when she heard the alarm clock in the room ringing. She wanted to go check but found a pot not far away. It seemed like someone was cooking soup. Out of curiosity, Lois went closer to take a look, but she was horrified when she saw that inside was the flesh of a child, the youngest member of the family. This was the most brutal case Lois had witnessed in more than 10 years of being a police officer. However, what puzzled the police was that the crime scene had not been cleaned up, but the murderer did not leave any fingerprints or DNA evidence. The only thing left was a pool of thick black liquid. Through investigation, the police learned that the victim's family lived in harmony and had no grudges against anyone, but it was clear that things were not that simple. The person who could commit such a brutal massacre clearly hated this family very much. Lois thought that the murderer must be a professional killer, so she guessed that the murderer might have committed similar crimes before. However, there was no record of any similar cases in the police records. The police department's investigation was completely interrupted. At this time, a nun named Megan, who claimed to be a reporter, came here. She came here specifically for this case. Lois thought that Megan just wanted to have attract views, so she was very cold. Out of respect for Orthodox religions, so Lois still accepted Megan. Megan said that she was always dedicated to investigating evil events. She learned about this case through her priest friend, so she came here. Lois looked at Megan's earnest eyes. She had no choice but to recount the events of the case. The victim's family died of heart failure, except for the husband. They clearly suffered a great shock before they died. It was not until 3 a.m. that the neighbors called the police because they were unable to sleep because of the loud Mozart music coming from the victim's house. But Megan guessed that it was the Requiem. Megan's accurate guess made Lois feel dangerous. Lois was alert and prepared to draw her gun to defend herself, but Megan gave a convincing reason that she said it was appropriate to play the Requiem. After all, it was Mozart's music to honor the dead. Lois suddenly had a hunch that things that could not be explained by science should perhaps be tested with the paranormal. So Lois mentioned the strange liquid found at the scene. Megan, based on Lois's description of the liquid's taste, guessed that it might be the smell of keratin emitted after hair burns. Anyway, Megan had never seen the specific situation, so she had to wait for the test results and then analyze it. But the first case had not been solved yet, and the murderer quickly committed the second case. When the police entered the house, they discovered that the toilet was very old, but very clean. It was clear that the homeowner was not a good person before he died. It was not until the curtains were pulled back that the police could clearly see what was nailed to the wall. One of the victims was not completely intact. The two people next to him had their lower bodies cut off. Such a brutal murder method did not leave a single drop of blood at the scene. It seemed that all the victim's blood had been sucked out. The police discovered a line on the wall saying, "I am clearly an abandoned person." At that time, no one could recognize the murderer's clue. Only a pool of black liquid remained at the crime scene. This time, Megan accompanied the police to the scene. The other policemen still did not understand what was happening when they found that Lois had taken Megan away, but then they quickly returned to the scene. It turned out that Lois thought that Megan could be of some help, so she warned the staff not to touch the scene. Lois decided to take Megan along to investigate. However, Lois did not know that she was being followed by a mysterious person. That evening, when Lois just got home, she suddenly heard strange noises around. She was immediately alert and pulled out her gun and followed the noise to the kitchen. Here, Lois discovered that the radio was playing Requiem. It was clear that the person who came had bad intentions. Lois immediately pulled up the window curtains and found that not far away there was a figure moving. Lois immediately chased after her, but because the distance was too far, she had run out of bullets. Finally, Lois still couldn't hit the target. Lois's daughter was awakened. Lois's daughter thought Lois was drunk and scolded her. Lois saw this and gave up and went inside. The next day, Megan went to Lois to discuss the case. Soon after, there was the analysis report of the black liquid. Megan knew it was high concentration sulfur dioxide. She immediately flipped through the book of Revelation in excitement. In the Bible, this is the substance in acid rain and a curse. It is the pungent and strong odor that Lois had described earlier. The Spirit of Jehovah is like a stream of sulfur, burning a third of humanity. But upon hearing these words, Lois believed that Megan was a fanatical zealot. Because the crime scene did not leave any traces of the murderer, so Lois had to go to the monastery to visit Megan herself. Megan then took Lois to her deduction room. From a religious perspective, Megan reinterpreted the murderer's psychology to Lois. Megan thought that Lois had gone in the wrong direction, but Lois still believed in the old-fashioned way of reasoning of the police. Lois thought that with her experience of solving 400 cases, she could catch the murderer. In the end, Lois was judged by Megan to have outdated thinking. Now, Megan's strange thoughts could only be shared with the handsome priest. The priest was very curious about the case Megan described. Megan felt that the priest was a best friend, so she shared her discoveries without hiding anything, but she had no idea that the priest was a pervert. When he was alone, he used a whip to beat himself. He muttered something, as if he was performing some kind of ritual. After talking to the priest, Megan discovered a new perspective. She speculated that the case was related to the satanic cult. But at this time, Lois stopped Megan's wild thoughts because the police identified the suspect through the bloodstains on the sidewalk. This person was Sullivan, a criminal who specialized in harvesting human organs to sell on the black market. He liked to kidnap children in war zones to make goods. After being exposed, Sullivan was sentenced to 21 years in prison. Now that he has been free for 9 months, Lois suspected that Sullivan had started planning to commit crimes again, so she immediately led armed forces to break into Sullivan's house. However, after the police searched everywhere everywhere. They were shocked by the scene in the basement. Lois slowly walked down and found Sullivan lying helplessly on the ground. Above him was his mother. When Lois approached, Sullivan's mother was still alive. When the police carried people away, the mother kept shouting Bible verses. Only then did Lois realize that the murderer deliberately left Sullivan's blood at the scene so that the police could follow the clues to the murderer's next case. This time, Lois discovered that the murderer had left a piece of paper and he had written his name on it. After Lois told the whole story, Megan suggested that they should look for the murderer from a philosophical perspective. Megan speculated that the murderer was most likely someone in the clergy. It might not be an Orthodox Catholic, but some strange cult. After all, these cultists really existed. They worshiped the control of the mind with drugs. After Lois returned home on a rainy night, she handed the box found at the crime scene to her daughter, who was good at solving puzzles. However, Lois's daughter studied it for a long time but still couldn't open it. Lois fell asleep while waiting. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps around woke her up. Lois immediately took her gun and patrolled the house. She ran to her daughter's room first, but didn't notice a figure passing behind her. After confirming that her daughter was safe, Lois was relieved. Suddenly, she received a call from the police station. It was clear that the murderer had committed the fourth case. When Lois arrived at the scene, she and her colleagues were shocked by the scene before their eyes. It was not until Megan arrived that Lois calmed down. The perpetrator recreates the last dinner, killing 12 homeless people and arranging them in horrifying artistic poses. Lois discovered that the person playing Jesus was the person she had given money to yesterday, but she did not expect them to meet again in such a situation. Lois was extremely shocked. Her mind was severely affected. She decided to go out drinking to relieve her fear. The 3 consecutive murders had not been solved, and the murderer committed a 4th case. The murderer sewed many body parts of the woman together into a corpse. There was even a strange goat head hanging in the head position. Lois observed carefully and was shocked to discover that these body parts came from the prostitutes she had helped. The tattoos and scars on their bodies all had special meanings, so Lois could recognize their identities immediately. This method of crime reminded Lois of tonight's dinner, which was spicy duck and chicken. This was an extremely complicated dish, requiring the duck meat to be chopped up and sewn together with needles and thread in the stomach cavity of the turkey before cooking. Lois immediately realized that the murderer was clearly provoking her. Because Lois had had a few drinks that night, she was still drunk. The others from afar could smell the alcohol on her. So the investigator Jack suggested that Lois go home and rest and wait for the forensic autopsy report. But Lois was extremely angry about that. She said exactly every piece of information about the owner of each piece of this body. Lois's dedication to each case moved everyone, but Jack could only helplessly say nothing. The next day, Lois and Megan went to the police station to discuss the 4th case that the killer had committed. Lois discovered that the common point was that many of the victims were the most famous prostitutes in town. It was obvious that the killer was disgusted by sexual acts. Megan believed that these 4 murders were considered by the killer as 4 essays. The killer wrote on the victims' bodies and drew own language. So Megan decided to decipher the meaning that the killer wanted to express. This was the key to solving the case. But this detail was not discovered by the other police. Lois relied on the sewing technique on the 3rd body to deduce that the killer could be someone with certain anatomical techniques, such as a surgeon or a forensic scientist. The most important thing was that the killer had some knowledge of Lois. Because the case had new developments, Megan, after rearranging the files, immediately contacted the priest to discuss the latest case content. At this time, the priest was wearing revealing clothes and dancing in the church. He suddenly became interested in Megan, so he asked her to personally bring the file. But when Megan arrived, she found that the priest was only wearing a shawl, plus his strong body and handsome face. Megan was attracted for a moment. She could not control her desire. But at the crucial moment, Megan was called to stop by the priest. Megan ran out of the room, and she lost control of her emotions for a moment. At this time, Lois went to her husband's bedside, but saw the nurse helping her husband clean the ulcer caused by lying down for a long time. Such a bloody scene made Lois almost throw up all the wine she had just drunk. She also realized that her husband's physical function was rapidly declining. The nurse took the opportunity to remind Lois to give up the idea of persisting with her husband and taking his ventilator off, but Lois did not want to comply. She was upset and ran away to drink some strong alcohol that she had brought with her. A caregiver named Eddie passed by and secretly lit a cigarette for Lois. Eddie knew that Lois was about to drive, so he kindly reminded Lois that driving could cause an accident, but Lois still insisted on driving herself. Not long after, the two met again. Lois had a car accident because of drunk driving. After waking up, she was handcuffed to the hospital bed. Her colleague helped Lois avoid jail, but the colleague decided not to release Lois for a short time. When the colleague left, Lois had no choice but to beg Eddie to help her escape from the hospital. Luckily, Eddie softened and agreed. Eddie followed Lois' instructions to take the key from her pocket. After Eddie uncuffed Lois, the two of them escaped from the hospital in disguise. Lois returned home and was surprised to find that her daughter had decoded the mysterious box she had brought back from the crime scene. There was a piece of paper with coordinates in it. Lois decided to go to that location to investigate. She asked Eddie, her new lover, to come to her house to help take care of her daughter for a day. Lois then drove Megan to the designated location. After driving all day, Lois gradually entered a smoky area. The deeper they went, the higher the temperature became. After arriving at the designated location, they discovered that the coordinates were a large crater. While the two were confused about what the murderer was trying to imply, a man suddenly drove up. Lois immediately picked up her gun to defend herself, but the man was not angry at all. He introduced himself as Joe, an employee of the Geological Bureau. Joe reminded the two of them that they were on a fault line. At this moment, the fire pit in front of them was the sinkhole on the natural gas tank. This pit was expanding every day, and it could not even be explained by science. Even Joe could not help but complain. This was really like the gates of hell, so Lois could only retreat with Megan. However, on the way back, the two of them met firefighters, putting out the fire of burning cars. Lois had no choice but to find a place to stay. When she tried to find a motel, she learned from the locals that this place was not suitable for staying. After a while of discussion, Lois got a fire blanket. She quickly drove away. However, while the car was moving, Lois discovered a woman in front of her, recklessly running running towards her car. Lois slowed down and picked up the woman. After the woman hid in the car, she shouted that he was here, but before Lois could react, she turned around and ran away from here. Lois followed the woman's instructions to a roadside motel. When she arrived, the woman quickly got out of the car and ran straight to the public restroom. Lois decided to stop there. So Lois picked up suitcase and prepared to check in, but discovered that the owner, despite her heavy makeup, could not hide the bruises on her face. Lois noticed this and took the initiative to ask if the owner needed help, but was flatly refused. Megan was a little uneasy about the woman, so she went to the women's restroom to look for, but found that there were bloody papers everywhere. The woman had disappeared without a trace. Megan and Lois found a series of bloody footprints on the ground. They followed the footprints and found that the woman had run far away. Lois had completely lost her patience, so she decided to go back to her room to rest first. After putting down her luggage, Megan felt even more uneasy. She wanted to go out to get some fresh air. Lois received a call from her superior, so she stayed in her room to answer the phone. Suddenly, there was a loud crash on the highway. Megan looked up and saw that two cars had crashed into each other again. She rushed to help the victims, but at this moment, Megan found that the owner's boyfriend was frantically pressing the owner's head into the swimming pool. Seeing this, Megan immediately ran to the two people. When the owner's boyfriend found out that he had been discovered, he stopped his violent behavior. Megan just felt that the world was too crazy, so she rushed to Lois for help. Megan told Lois about the crazy behavior outside, but Lois was very worried because the signal was interrupted. Lois asked her boss for help and wanted to contact the command center by landline, but she couldn't get through, no matter how she called. Suddenly, Lois heard gunshots. She immediately went back to the room and took the gun she always carried with her. While loading the bullets, Lois and Megan suddenly heard the owner's terrified scream. The two opened the door to check and found that the owner's boyfriend was pointing a gun at the bloody woman. The owner was trying to stop her. At this moment, a car came from somewhere. The owner's boyfriend saw this and frantically opened fire at the helpless woman. Suddenly, a man got out of the car. The man calmly prepared to take the bloody woman away. Seeing this, Megan completely lost her composure. She didn't even hesitate to stop him, but because of that, Megan was unfortunately shot. Everything happened so suddenly that Lois didn't have time to react. Fortunately, the police station, because the signal was suddenly interrupted, detected that something was wrong and sent a car to pick up the two people. Thanks to the timely emergency care, Megan's life was saved. But the priest and Lois's police colleagues were extremely disappointed in Lois. They thought that Lois was too selfish and had put the innocent Megan in danger. Therefore, Lois felt extremely guilty, and she also realized that this was aimed at her. While chatting with her colleagues, Lois suddenly learned that some of the criminals she had arrested had been released, especially Glorious, Lois's enemy. The time Glorious was released from prison, the time of the first murder, and this one coincided. Lois thought that all of this could be revenge. Very soon after that, the killer continued to commit crimes. The crime scene was so brutal that it made the forensic doctors vomit non-stop. When Lois entered, she discovered that the abdomens of the two women had been cut open with surgical instruments, stretched to the maximum. The killer had brutally cut open the victims' abdomens, and the women eventually died from excessive blood loss. Because the case was getting more and more serious, the police still couldn't find the killer, so the Federal Bureau of Investigation decided to take over the case. Lois was also facing the risk of being fired, but she was extremely dissatisfied. Just because the time the killer committed the crime and the time Lois escaped from the hospital coincided, Lois thought the killer just wanted to provoke her. Therefore, she was even more determined to investigate the killer's background. Lois went to the victim's house and found that the victim had 3 other children. The children seemed to be scared. Through the story of one child, Lois knew that it seemed that their mother had gone out with a man she knew before she died. The other children didn't know anything more. Lois had no choice but to comfort the children, and she drove nearby to check, but she found a car stopped in the middle of the road. There was also a pool of blood in the driver's seat. After Lois investigated the surroundings, she found a crazy woman holding a bloody child, trembling in the orange grove, not knowing what to do. Lois tried to approach the woman as gently as possible and took the weak child from her arms. Then Lois prepared to take the woman to the emergency room. Lois took the woman to the hospital. The doctors examined the woman but found out that she was not the mother and that the woman was too old to be able to give birth. Even the blood on her body was not hers. It was obvious that the child was not hers. Lois felt very strange. Lois found that the woman had regained consciousness and took the initiative to talk to her. At this time, the woman calmed down and took the initiative to tell Lois that her name was Maisie. Then, Maisie anxiously asked about the child's whereabouts. At this point, Lois confirmed through DNA comparison that the child Maisie was holding was not related to the murder victim. Then Lois patiently asked Maisie if she remembered where she gave birth, but Maisie couldn't answer because she was nervous. Then she started to change the subject. Maisie kept mentioning the word golden. Lois didn't understand what she was saying. Lois just saw Maisie mumbling something over and over again. Lois suddenly realized that Maisie was clearly mentally ill, so Lois stopped staying with Maisie and resolutely took Maisie to a mental hospital. Through her colleague, Lois learned that Maisie was actually a human trafficker. Lois had a hunch that Maisie might be related to Glorious. To clarify everything, Lois went to Glorious. Glorious took the initiative to invite Lois to house to talk. Meanwhile, Lois's subordinates discovered that there were many people carrying weapons nearby. He carefully pulled out his gun as a precaution, then informed Lois that there was an ambush nearby. Lois also started to be alert. When the first gunshot rang out, Lois immediately restrained Glorious and took out a gun from her bag. Under Lois's threat, Glorious continued to speak, but through Glorious's words, Lois learned an important piece of information. Maisie knew the murderer. That night, Lois was deep in thought when she received a strange phone call. The other party just gasped. Lois guessed that it was probably the murderer calling, so she scolded the other party and hung up. Lois just felt extremely frustrated, and suddenly she discovered a flash of light outside the window. Lois immediately took her gun and chased after him, but found out that her husband's personal nurse had come to visit in person. The nurse brought wine and said that she wanted the relationship between the two to return to normal. Lois had no choice but to politely invite the nurse into the house, but Lois heard the nurse tell her about how the nurse was infatuated with Lois' husband's achievement. Lois patiently listened to the nurse and then pointed a gun at the nurse's face and chased her out of the house. house. Then Lois found Maisie. Lois decided to ask for information about the murderer. Unexpectedly, Maisie refused to reveal anything and only told Lois where the children she had kidnapped were hidden. When the police arrived at the location provided by Maisie, they were shocked by the scene before their eyes. Pregnant women were treated like animals. They were tied to racks with a breast pump in front of their chests responsible for collecting their milk. Then through the tube, it was slowly fed into the children's mouths, and the children drank from bottles unconsciously. After saving the women, Lois was attracted to a mysterious place by a song. She entered and found the wall covered with secret photos of herself. Suddenly, a man with a knife appeared from behind and restrained Lois. But Lois was on guard. She quickly put some distance between the two and shot the man down. Lois then took off the man's mask. She was horrified when she saw his face. Lois was even more surprised when she discovered that Eddie, whom she had just dated, was now with her daughter. Lois felt her spirit completely collapse. Before going crazy, Lois drank all her wine and angrily left the scene. She drove to the hospital and decided to abandon her husband who was lying on the bed. The nurses were very reluctant, but in the end, they could only accept Lois's decision. While the doctor was performing the euthanasia on Lois's husband, Lois stood by and read the Bible to pray for her husband's soul. When Lois's husband was removed from the oxygen tank, she threw the Bible on him with relief. Lois no longer had any lingering feelings. Lois turned her back and walked out of the hospital coldly. She went home and slept. The next day, Lois made an important discovery. She discovered traces left by the murderer at the priest's house. It turned out that the person Lois had removed the mask from before was the priest, and he was the murderer of all the cases. The notebook on the table recorded the murders in detail. Lois was scared when she suddenly discovered an unusual piece of paper in the diary. It turned out to be Lois's husband's. The certificate of euthanasia was recommended, along with the conclusion of the case. The serial murders were over. Lois became a great contributor. While everyone was congratulating Lois, her superior called Lois into the office again. Her superior announced that Lois will be fired and promised to pay her a large severance pay and an annual pension of $146,000. But Lois still felt that she still had the ability, so she refused without hesitation. But Lois didn't know that she had already refused the chance to live. The news about Megan's follow-up interview had also ended. The news received a very good response, attracting a lot of followers, so she deliberately sought out Lois to drink and celebrate together. But Lois didn't want to pretend anymore. She had seen through Megan's lies. Every time a case happened, Megan could arrive at the scene in time, or even arrive first, because Megan had always been an accomplice of the priest. After Lois saw through Megan's lies, Megan also stopped pretending and rushed to attack Lois. Today, between the two of them, one of them would definitely die. Lois was not Megan's opponent at first, but fortunately, she had many years of combat experience. After a while, Megan couldn't gain the upper hand. Lois wanted to take the gun in her bag. Unexpectedly, Megan was alert and quickly dropped her bag on the ground. The gun thus fell to the other side of the table. Lois tried to use the glass to create distance, but Megan went crazy and attacked. Even though a pot of boiling hot soup was poured on her head, Megan still rushed forward and stabbed Lois in the waist with a knife. At this time, both of them were injured, but Megan reacted faster and pressed Lois to the ground. Then Megan pulled out the knife and stabbed Lois frantically. Suddenly, an illusion appeared in Lois's subconscious. Lois's husband, Marshall, who was supposed to be dead, had to face the fact that his daughter wanted to divorce her husband. Marshall, with the principle of reconciliation, did not interfere in the divorce. But soon after, Marshall heard the heartbreaking truth that his son-in-law was having an affair with Lois. Marshall was extremely shocked and desperate when he heard it. But since his daughter had made her choice, Marshall decided to respect her. Then he went to the hospital in a sad mood. Lois was now completely paralyzed. Even though the doctor advised Marshall to euthanize his wife many times, Marshall was still hesitant and refused to give up because of an obsession in his heart. He prayed that Lois would wake up, so he took good care of his wife every day. Ever since Marshall learned the truth that Lois was having an affair with his son-in-law, he felt that he should also give up. So Marshall went to the doctor and decided to give up on continuing Lois's treatment. The doctor said that it could be done tomorrow. Only then did Marshall breathe a sigh of relief. He found his lover to tell about Lois and his son-in-law's story. The lover was doing a sensitive live broadcast. He helped Marshall complain about Lois's betrayal, but then the lover hurriedly left. Unexpectedly, this charming and sexy lover was a nurse in Lois's world. But what was even more shocking was that Megan had colluded with the priest who was now Lois's boss. Because Megan was too perfectionist at work, she often made things difficult for Lois. Therefore, the two did not like each other. But after Megan heard that Lois would be given a peaceful death, Megan still decided to visit her on her last night. At this time, in Lois's perception, the most evil priest became her doctor. When Megan came to the hospital room, Marshall chased her away because he hated Megan for always making things difficult for Lois. And now the son-in-law came to bother her even more. Marshall felt extremely angry. He accidentally slammed the door to the hospital room, isolating the two of them. Then, despite his daughter's objections, Marshall immediately asked the doctors to euthanize Lois. Marshall's pride was hurt, and he took all his anger out on Lois. While the drug was slowly being injected into body, Lois, unaware of anything, was still in her own world, fighting with Megan. Finally, Megan raised her gun and shot Lois straight in the head. At the same time, in the illusion of Lois's oxygen tank being removed, her heart stopped beating. Lois suddenly felt like she was flying in the air like an outsider. Lois watched the final battle between Megan and herself. Lois used her last bit of strength to pull Megan to the ground. As fresh blood continuously flowed from the back of Megan's neck, Lois's heart suddenly started beating again in the hospital room. She only felt her body falling rapidly. At the same time, Lois, who was confronting Megan, picked up her gun and shot Megan in the head. After a gunshot, Lois on the hospital bed suddenly opened her eyes, completely returning to the real world. After Lois woke up from her sleep, she became a medical miracle who had been revived after her heart stopped beating. Therefore, Dr. Tom was very interested in researching Lois. Tom even deliberately sought out Lois's daughter to try to discuss the treatment process. To be exact, Lois was in a coma. Things that happened in the dream world all had traces in the real world. Tom mentioned a very interesting thing, that Lois had dreamed that her daughter was too fat in her dream. Lois's daughter wanted to take advantage of her weight to participate in a program called Half a Ton of Damage. The word half a ton made Lois's daughter feel very offended. Lois's daughter said that she hated TV shows and never never liked watching movies. Meanwhile, Lois had woken up and was being cared for and rehabilitated because her 2 legs still couldn't keep their balance. Her patience was running out. At this moment, the priest, who was now a doctor, walked in. Lois was immediately furious. With her, the priest was still the evil murderer. Lois uneasily approached her hospital bed, but suddenly, the image of herself lying on her deathbed appeared before her eyes. Her daughter was still by her side, cheering her on. At that moment, her daughter only felt dizzy. At this time, Marshall was discussing with his lover about preparing to divorce Lois. At this time, Marshall was completely determined to ask a lawyer to draft a divorce agreement and end the relationship with Lois. Marshall's lover was extremely happy after hearing this because she was looking forward to officially living with the person she loved. At this time, Megan was being interrogated by Tom. Megan recalled every moment with Lois. Before Lois fell into a coma, at Lois's retirement celebration, the 2 of them made purple grape juice together. Lois was hesitant about retiring, but Megan strongly opposed her staying. The 2 of them argued fiercely because of that. The doctor recorded everything. After Megan finished the interrogation, she returned home. Even though she was a police officer, she was always controlled by her boyfriend at home. Every time she was beaten, Megan did not dare to fight back. This time, she could not bear it anymore and pulled out a gun. Megan's boyfriend was not afraid at all because he was very sure that she did not have the courage to shoot. In the end, Megan did not shoot. She angrily drove away from home to the beach to relax. At night, Megan could only live temporarily in a hotel. After consulting with Lois and Megan, Tom decided to resume psychological treatment for Lois. Lois had been in a coma for 6 months, and even when she woke up, she still had difficulty adapting to the real world. The doctors used electroencephalography to monitor her and found no abnormalities. Lois always felt that some of her dream memories were fading. She even had an intuition that she was still in a coma. Seeing this, Tom communicated with her about the connection between dreams and reality. In reality, Lois's daughter was a university lecturer with a bright and radiant identity. But in Lois's dream, she was worried about her daughter's fat body. That's why Lois's daughter wanted to participate in a program for obese people. Lois then talked about Marshall being bedridden in her dream. The doctor thought that it was because Lois in reality lacked control in her marriage. So in her dream, she created a wife who could decide the life or death of her vegetative husband. Then the 2 discussed Megan, who had a strong opposite personality. Through the conversation, the doctor discovered that Megan was an extremely selfish person. This disgusted Lois. So Lois, who was not religious, turned Megan into an eccentric nun, but Lois still felt annoyed by the image of a drunkard in her dream. Seeing this, Tom patiently guided Lois. Lois just added real-life emotions to the dream and then recreated it. Only then did Lois have a little sense of belonging to the present. After a period of rehabilitation, Lois was finally discharged from the hospital. What surprised Lois was that Megan came to pick her up and leave the hospital. The 2 of them really didn't get along at all. They started arguing after just a short distance. Before leaving, Lois noticed that Megan seemed to have bruises on her body. Even though the 2 of them didn't get along, Lois still used her own way to remind Megan to quickly get out of her current situation with her boyfriend. After Lois returned home, the nanny Maisie was already waiting at home. Seeing Lois return to normal, Maisie felt very relieved. Next, Maisie continued her rehabilitation program by Lois's side. Finally, Lois was able to face the priest. Lois believed that dreams also reflected reality. Therefore, Lois was sure that she had a grudge against the priest. The priest must have done something, and Lois, who was in a coma, heard it. The priest's eyes were filled with astonishment. After Lois left the hospital, she went to see her daughter. Lois's daughter still couldn't forget about Lois's affair with her husband. Lois's daughter angrily slapped Lois. Lois couldn't hold back her tears when she saw her daughter refusing to accept her. Lois collapsed in the car, not knowing where to go. Fortunately, Maisie was there to comfort her. Lois calmed down and went to Marshall's house, and his lover personally delivered the divorce papers. She decided to save some face for each other. However, Marshall was equally angry with Lois. He used insulting words to scold Lois for her adultery. Lois completely accepted it. After all, it was her fault. The next day, when Lois' daughter saw Lois again, she was finally much more sober. Lois told her daughter that the son-in-law was a bad man, but Lois's daughter was still very angry about Lois's actions. Lois felt helpless. Finally, Lois gave up and told her daughter that she was going to move out. Seeing that her daughter had no reaction, Lois did not want to hold on to their mother-daughter relationship anymore, so she slapped her daughter. Lois went to Tom for psychological counseling. She imagined her late father as a stranger who showed her the way in times of trouble. Lois was very emotional when she said this. After listening, Tom introduced Lois to a veteran psychologist named Min. Min would be responsible for helping Lois analyze dreams related to criminal cases. After Min entered the room, Lois was shocked by his appearance. Lois was extremely shocked because Min had polio. Only his fingers could move, so Min could only operate the computer and chat with Lois. Min asked Lois if she had ever encountered a similar case in real life. After recalling, Lois remembered the story of the dairy factory. The women were tied to the milking machine like cows that provided food for the children. In Lois's opinion, her subconscious probably thought that women had lost their power and were being treated as tools of production. This dream also made Lois very sad. In fact, Lois and Maisie went to the feminist meeting at the town hall together. However, when mentioning other cases, Lois was somewhat resistant to continuing the discussion. Min believed that only by understanding what scared Lois was the way to heal her psychological wounds. When she saw that Lois was very sad, Min suddenly mentioned a seminar on whether compassion was gradually disappearing in society. The speaker called this behavior a degeneration of humanity. Tom thought that the terrible cases in Lois's dream were related. Then Tom took the initiative to end the counseling session. After Lois returned home, she found out that Marshall's lover was coming to visit. Marshall's lover, who had been madly in love with Marshall, was now planning to leave him. In fact, Marshall's lover also admired Lois's freedom. Lois could freely go wherever she wanted. Before leaving, Marshall's lover and Lois shook hands and made peace. But Lois felt more tired than ever. She was about to go to bed to rest when she received a phone call from Megan. Lois arrived at the crime scene and was horrified to find that her dream had come true. The opening scene of the movie appeared before Lois' eyes again. Fortunately, it was just a dream. Lois woke up to the sound of the phone ringing, but found out that it was Megan calling. Lois was tired and wanted to hang up, but Megan suddenly begged Lois to come to the hotel to find her. When Megan took out the bottle containing the black liquid, Lois's expression expression immediately changed. Lois thought that someone must have invaded her dream and started copying. Lois felt extremely depressed. She suddenly pulled out a knife and signaled Megan to attack her. Only blood could make Lois feel at ease. After Megan did as she was told with a puzzled expression, Lois calmed down. Lois went to the bathroom to treat her wound. At this time, Megan's boyfriend finally found the hotel. He was very angry that Megan had run away. This time, Megan refused to give in. Megan's boyfriend felt that his authority was being challenged, so he hit Megan again. Hearing the noise outside, Lois immediately pulled out her gun. She recalled her memories from before, and her spirit completely collapsed. But Megan's boyfriend mistook Lois's hesitation at this moment for fear in her heart, so he directly covered Megan's mouth with the gun to provoke Lois. But Megan's boyfriend underestimated Lois's madness. She had been hesitating between reality and dream, and finally made a decision. Lois shot Megan's boyfriend without hesitation. The evil boyfriend was shot dead on the spot. Megan was also terrified by the scene. Lois just felt that life was tiring. She had just returned home when she saw Marshall and his lover coming uninvited. Lois impatiently asked Marshall's purpose of the trip, but Marshall smugly suggested that he wanted the three of them to live happily together. Marshall's lover even said that she was willing to take care of the family's living expenses. Lois rejected Marshall without hesitation and kicked the two out of the house. On the way back, Marshall's lover did not hide that she came here just to watch the show. Then she frankly expressed her boredom with this poor desert town. Marshall quietly listened to his lover pour out his heart. Before getting off the car, Marshall still expressed his feelings deeply. In fact, Marshall was not as virtuous and respectable as his appearance. He longed for the disorderly ancient Roman Empire and promoted the view of living for oneself. It was not until Megan and the police entered the classroom that Marshall restrained himself a little. It was not until after school that Megan accused Marshall of raping a female student. Marshall was a little surprised. He quickly opened his phone to take out the message history and proved that it was just a normal love relationship. Even so, Megan would not tolerate Marshall. He was quickly released, but this experience made Marshall feel humiliated, so he directly chose to leave this world. Fortunately, Marshall's lover took him to the hospital in time. Marshall's health was not seriously affected. When Marshall woke up, his lover directly proposed to break up. After speaking, Marshall's lover turned around and left. Upon receiving the news, Marshall's daughter rushed over. Because Lois's daughter had cut the relationship with Lois, so she could not bear to lose her father. She told her father to live well and then hurriedly left. When Marshall was discharged from the hospital, Eddie came to pick him up. Marshall did not want to go because this was the man who had had an affair with Lois. But when Eddie suggested taking Marshall to meet a group of pure men, Marshall agreed. When Marshall arrived, he met a group of men, led by Dr. Min. Following Dr. Min's introduction, Marshall gave an emotional speech. He couldn't contain his resentment and show support for men. Marshall believed that men's rights were being taken away from women, so he wanted to solve this problem. Finally, Marshall decided to use the form of crime to put the principal back on track. After Marshall finished his speech, the hall erupted in continuous and enthusiastic applause. At this time, Lois, who was confused, found Dr. Tom and continued to express her confusion. She thought that she might be dead. Then Lois raised a few suspicions. Tom had raped women while they were in a coma and forced them to get pregnant. When Lois made this accusation, Tom mocked her contemptuously, saying that Lois was living in her own self-made prison. Lois felt even more that this world was a prison designed for her. Then Lois mentioned that she had shot Megan's boyfriend. However, when Lois returned to the hotel room, she found that the inside had been cleaned up. Megan also stopped mentioning it. Lois did not accept it, so she followed and investigated Megan. Finally, Lois discovered that Megan had contacted the cleaning staff to dispose of the corpse to hide her crime. At this time, the authority of the law was challenged. Lois could not control herself and went to the police station to report Megan's actions, but was denied. Lois increasingly suspected that this was a trick the devil used to torture herself. Lois thought that this world was like a puzzle. Each piece created a dream for her. While Dr. Tom listened, he repeatedly emphasized that Lois was still alive. According to Dr. Tom, Lois's case was very special. Tom thought that the reason Lois had so many strange dreams was because she was affected by the cases she had handled, but Lois argued with Dr. Tom about whether she was sane or not. Finally, Lois tiredly returned to the hospital room. After some time had passed, Megan suddenly rushed into the hospital room and lay on Lois's lap, crying. After Megan calmed down, she admitted that after the priest was shot dead, she had found someone to dispose of the body. However, the purpose of Megan's trip was a difficult case. She thought that only Lois could solve it, and Lois was finally moved. She went to the crime scene and once again witnessed the murderer staging the murder scene. The murderer copied the famous painting of the Last Dinner. What surprised Lois was that this time, the image of Jesus was added. It was the priest. After regaining her composure, Lois said that she would solve the case in an hour. Then she calmly went to the corner where the murderer attacked her in her dream and waited for the murderer to appear. That is the entire content of the movie. Thank you everyone for watching.